You know, I believe with a little bit of guidance, anyone can create a work of art. You'll be amazed at how quickly you can pick up painting with my simple instructions today. Not only is this painting today going to be simple and fun, but it also can be a relaxing and rewarding hobby as well. Now, to get started, we need some watercolor painting supplies. I, of course, have some watercolor paints and water, and then I also have some watercolor paper. Now, you can cut this to any size that you'd like. You can use a small piece and just play around with this painting with only one or two of the flowers we're going to learn today, or you can use a larger piece like I am with many flowers. Really, just whatever you'd like to try out and experiment with. We just want this to be fun. As you can see, I do have a few little pencil marks on my page here that I'll be using as a guide for my flower and stem placement. I like to do this because it just helps give me an idea of how I want my composition to sort of look in the end. But this can totally be done as a free-handed piece if you work better that way. For my simple drawing though, I first drew some circles for the centers of the flowers so I can decide and know where I'd like my main flowers to be on the page. I have about 6 of these circles, but you can do as many or as few of these as you'd like. You're the artist for your work. I am just the guide. Then after I have an idea of how many and where I want these flowers to be placed, then I can start adding in some stem lines. I have, of course, some lines for the circles or for the flowers that I plan on having, and then I also have a few extra stem lines or little shoots or branches off of the stems that I can maybe add some leaves or buds onto later. Now, one last thing you may notice is that I have erased or left a small area around the circle flowers empty. The reason for this is so I have room to paint in some petals around these circles without potentially having pencil lines showing through some of the petals later. But this, of course, is an optional step. Like I say, this is just a guide. As I get going, I may decide to change things up a bit and add to or take away something. We'll just play it by ear. Okay, let's pull out a few brushes that we can use on this piece today. I'm thinking maybe a number 6 round, a number 3 round, and a number 1 rigger. We'll be painting wildflowers on the smaller side today. If you bought one of my sets, then you can just follow right along with me here. But if not, no worries. You can use the brushes you already have on hand. And as a quick side note, any of the supplies you see me using today will be listed in the description of this video, along with links if you're interested. I also need to apologize for the sun and shadows shining on my page today. I'm painting this in the early morning, so the sun is coming in straight at me. I blocked it off the best I could, but I do still have a little bit sneaking through here. All right, I'm going to tape my paper down with some artist tape really quickly, but I'll let you in on a little secret into the future. This piece might actually be easier to do if you don't tape it down. I found later that it may have been easier to paint some of these flowers if I could have had the freedom to turn my paper around. So the choice here is up to you. Let's go ahead now and get started painting in some of these little flower heads. I'll pull out the smaller number 3 round brush first, and maybe we'll give some small petals a try to start off. Now, another tough decision you're going to need to make as the artist here is what colors you'd like to use. Since it happens to be autumn time right now, I'm choosing some autumn colors today, but you, of course, can pick whatever you'd like to try. If you'd like to follow along with me, I'll pull out some Gamboge first. But I did sort of feel like this was a little darker than I wanted, so to lighten and brighten that color a little bit, I'll also add in a touch of azo yellow. Now, for the petals on this piece, we are just going to keep them as simple and easy as possible. Let's try using just 1 or maybe 2 strokes of the brush to create these. All I'm doing here is placing the tip of the brush here near the center circle. Then I'll push down on the brush a little bit so that the belly or the larger end of the brush touches down on the paper. And at the same time, I'll just gently pull out the brush as well to make a lovely petal shape. If you like a more thick or rounded petal, you can just add another stroke or 2 to the first one to make it a little larger. Now you can just keep this simple and leave this flower exactly how it is. Or you can add in a touch of shadow color on the inside part of the petals nearest the center of the flower. I'll just add maybe a bit of cadmium orange here and give that a try for the shadow color. It's probably best if you can add in this shadow color when the paint is still wet to help it blend better, but mine has pretty much dried out now. So what I'm going to do is take a bit of the orange color, place a tiny bit on the petals, then I'll wet and dry my brush off and use the slightly damp bristles to spread out or blend in that color a little bit. All right, great job. That was not too bad. So let's do another one. I'm going to change up my color here for this next one a little bit though. So I'm going to add some more of that cadmium orange, or you could even try some cadmium red, to the yellow that's already on our tray to darken it up a bit and create a yellow orangey color. Now let's use this color to once again paint on some flower petals onto this next flower. I want these to be a little bit thicker or longer than the first flower we painted, so I'm just going to push and pull on the brush a little bit more to help with that. And on this flower, I'd like to try painting at more of a side-facing view, so I'm going to leave the top area open or unpainted with maybe a couple of small petals on the ends up here to help that effect. This is really the most simple and easy way to paint flower petals. It is quick and effective and isn't too complicated because you're just using the same stroke over and over again. These paintbrushes in particular work really well for petals like this because they have such nice pointy tips and then gradually taper and transition to a larger belly. I'd also like to add in some shadow color on this flower as well. Once again, my paint has pretty much dried at this point, so I'm just going to take a bit of cadmium red here, paint a tiny bit of that color on the center area of the petal, then I'll wet and dry my brush off and use the damp brush to spread and blend the paint in. All right, let's paint another flower. The good news is that we'll again be using a similar technique, but this time I'm going to switch over to the number 6 brush now. I'll add in a little bit of cadmium red to the color on my palette to darken and change it up just a little bit more. Then I'll start painting on the petals around this little circle down here, just like we've been doing, starting at the center of the flower with a nice point of the brush, then pushing down and pulling the brush outward. I'm going to paint these petals all the way around the flower, and I'm also going to make them a little longer in length as well by pulling that brush out a little farther. I love helping people feel more comfortable and confident in their painting abilities and artistic skills. The last few tutorials I've put on here have been a little more complicated and detailed, but I like to have a variety of skill level paintings on here, so that's why this week I chose to paint something a little more on the easy and beginner friendly side of things. This piece doesn't necessarily require a lot of experience. You can get the hang of it pretty quickly with a little bit of practice. And whether you're an advanced painter or not, it doesn't ever hurt to just paint something simple for the pure fun and enjoyment of it. If you're finding this tutorial helpful so far, I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't already so you don't miss out on more of my painting tutorials and painting tips that I put out every week. After I've got all of the petals on here, I'll do just as we've done before and add in a little shadow color to the petals here using some cadmium red. Okay, I think I'm going to change up this next flower a little bit by making the petals more broad and rounded. I'll just go ahead and use the same colors on my tray for this, but the trick here is to use some nice broad strokes of the brush to create each petal. I'll probably use 2 or maybe 3 strokes to finish off a single petal, then I'll continue with this until that center area is completely surrounded. I personally think it's kind of nice to paint this flower a little different than the others to help create some sort of interest in our painting. I think I've said this before a long time ago, but I had an art professor in college that would often tell us that something to remember when creating a painting or composition is that same is boring, boring, boring. Here you can see that we're changing up not only the colors as we go, but we're also changing the sizes, the shapes, and angles of the petals and flowers, which helps make our painting more interesting to look at. Just something to keep in mind. I'll also add a little bit of cadmium red to the centers of these petals as well for a bit of shadow color. All right, let's darken up our color even more now by adding in a touch of alizarin crimson. Then let's try another side-facing flower off to the right side of the page here. While I've got this red color out, I'm going to switch my brush back over to the small number 3 really quickly and paint in one more small flower using the red paint. Okay, that's it for the main flower petals on the page. Now let's add in some bud accents. I think I'll lighten up this color by adding in a bit of gamboge to a portion of the paint so I have some red-orange again. Then I'll paint in a few buds on this penciled in stem that I have approximately in the center of the page. And although you can freehand this part, this is where I find having some pencil lines or marks to be a little helpful so that I have an idea of where I'd like to put them. I'll have 2 larger buds near the bottom and 3 small buds up at the top. These are not complicated shapes at all, just some sort of circular blobs of color. For the next buds I'm going to place in here, I'm actually going to use a bit more of that red color of paint that I still have on my tray. I plan to have more greenery surrounding the base of these ones, so for these I'm painting on sort of an oval shape which can represent just the tip area of the bud. I'll paint maybe 7 or 8 of these kind, again sort of going along or around the pencil marks on my page. For this bud down here, why not just have some fun and maybe paint it a little larger or with the look of it starting to open? Okay, next up, still using this small number 3 brush, let's take a little bit of olive green paint and start painting in the greenery along the stems and with some of these buds. Some of this greenery will include the greenery at the bottom of the buds that represent the area that the flower petals bloom from, and I'll also throw in here a few small or tiny leaves along some of these stems too. You might notice that I'll add some green bud-looking shapes maybe at the tops or sprouting alongside some of these stems as well. We're just going to go with the flow and add them here and there and wherever they may look good. I will point out though that I am going to keep this part to a minimum. I don't want this to overpower or distract from the main wildflowers on the page. This should just be a fun accent that adds to the painting. This looks pretty good for now. They look fairly minimal and evenly applied throughout the page, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next part here. But keep in mind, we can always come back in here and add a few more leaves or a few more buds later if we feel like it needs it. It's time to pull out the rigger brush now, my favorite brush to use when I need to paint some nice thin lines. I'm going to mix up a color for the stems on the page by using some raw sienna and then adding in some of this olive green color to darken it up and create a bit more of a brownish greenish color. Now I'll just load up my brush with that color, and the key here is to roll the entire bristle head into the color, not just the tip of the brush. Then after the brush is loaded with lots of color, then you can start painting in the stem lines for the flowers and buds, connecting and tying the whole picture together. If you happen to find while you're doing this part that the lines are not spreading or painting on very well, there's a couple of things that might help. First, make sure that the paint is a little more on the watery side. We want it to be nice and liquidy. If it's more dried out and concentrated, it tends to run out or not paint on as smoothly or as well. And secondly, as I mentioned before, roll the entire bristle head into the paint, not just the tip. This is basically helping to store more paint in the brush, so as you paint the lines, the liquidy paint will sort of run down the bristles and in a sense refill it as you go. Another thing to look out for if your lines start out being too thick because you've got a lot of paint in the bristles, I didn't really do it on this piece today, paint the lines from the bottom of the stem moving upward. Then you'll naturally get a thicker line at the base of the stem, and as the paint begins to run out of the brush, it will make the stem line thinner at the top. If you don't want to work from the bottom up, then you can also just gently dab the tip of the brush on your paper towel to take off some of that excess paint, which will in turn help your lines start out a little more thin. These are all things to just play around with a little bit so you can find a method that works the best for you. And of course, if you can't quite complete the stem line with just one stroke of the brush, you can always dip it in the paint again and continue on where you left off. All right, I think that's it for all of the stem lines. The only thing left to paint in is the centers of the flowers. I'll switch back over to the number 3 round once again and then darken up this color here with a little bit of ivory black to make a nice sort of dark brownish color. Then I'll paint in the centers of the flowers, painting maybe some thin lines around the edges and then filling in the center. Well, this was a super fun and simple little exercise, perfect for beginners or even just for practicing petal strokes of the brush. This was just an enjoyable little wildflower piece to do, and now that you know some of the basics here, you really have a lot of possibilities. You can add more or less flowers or buds, maybe try bigger leaves or even grass blades stemming from the bottom of the page, and even try out some different colors, compositions, arrangements, and sizes. Really, the possibilities are limitless. If you did enjoy this tutorial, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel so I can continue to help you discover your artistic side.